Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're having a wonderful and blessed day. Today we dive deep into Love in the Storm. After losing everything, Quan and Tu Lac are forced to live in a humble thatched hut. Watch as Quan works in the fields like a farmer, tenderly bathes his wife with well water, and their love shines even brighter in the hardest times. But just when hope appears, devastating news from the lawyer arrives. If you're enjoying this emotional roller coaster, don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. The rain fell softly over the coffee hills of Dak Lac, a gentle veil that blurred the boundary between earth and sky. It wasn't the kind of storm that destroyed, but the kind that soaked slowly into everything: clothes, skin, and the cracks in a wounded heart. Quan carried Tu Lac in his arms as they followed Mrs. Huang and the kind-hearted neighbor, Uncle Tu, down a narrow dirt path. The wooden house they had once called Sanctuary now stood sealed behind yellow tape in the distance. Their footsteps squelched in the red mud. The baby, wrapped tightly against Mrs. Huang's chest, let out a small, restless cry. "This way," Uncle Tu said quietly, pushing open the creaking bamboo gate of his modest thatched hut. It's small, but it's dry. The roof doesn't leak much when the wind isn't too strong. The house was humble beyond words. 2 small rooms with earthen walls, a thatched roof, and a floor of packed dirt covered by woven mats. A single wooden bed stood in the corner of the main room, its frame worn smooth by generations. There was no electricity, only a kerosene lamp casting warm, flickering shadows. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp soil, and faint coffee blossoms. Quan lowered Tu Lac onto the bed with infinite care. Her body still felt too light, too fragile after the hemorrhage and the endless stress. She winced as her back touched the thin mattress, but she bit her lip and said nothing. "Thank you, Uncle," Quan said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We won't trouble you for long." Uncle Tu waved a weathered hand. "Stay as long as you need. In these hills, we help each other. That's how we survive." That first night, sleep came in fragments. The baby woke every 2 hours, hungry and unsettled by the new surroundings. Tu Lac struggled to sit up each time, her stitches pulling with every movement. Quan stayed awake beside her, supporting her back, helping their son latch while wiping sweat from her forehead with a cool cloth. "You should rest," she whispered once, voice cracking. "You've been carrying me all day." "I'll rest when you're stronger," he replied simply. His hand never left hers. Dawn arrived gray and misty. Quan rose before the roosters, borrowing an old Baba shirt and a conical hat from Uncle Tu. He kissed Tu Lac's temple, then stepped out into the cool morning air. The coffee plantation stretched endlessly before him. Rows of green bushes heavy with ripening cherries. For the first time in years, Nguyen Quan, former CEO of a crumbling empire, picked up a hoe and walked into the fields with the villagers. His palms blistered within the first hour. The muscles in his back screamed in protest. But he kept working, matching the steady rhythm of the farmers around him. Each swing of the hoe felt like penance and promise at once. Back at the hut, Mrs. Huang was undergoing her own quiet transformation. The woman who once commanded boardrooms now knelt awkwardly by the stone stove, trying to light a fire with damp kindling. Smoke billowed into her face. She coughed violently, but refused to give up. Tu Lac watched from the bed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Mother, you don't have to." "I do," Mrs. Huang cut in, voice hoarse. "I have spent my life breaking things. Let me try to mend what I can." By midday, she had managed to boil a simple pot of rice porridge. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were now red and rough from scrubbing the baby's cloth diapers in a basin of cold well water. She moved slowly, her back aching, but there was a new determination in her eyes, a quiet resolve to atone. When Quan returned at noon, drenched in sweat and streaked with mud, he found Tu Lac attempting to stand. She had only taken 3 shaky steps when her legs buckled. He rushed forward, catching her before she could fall. "Easy," he murmured, lifting her effortlessly. "You're still healing." He carried her to the small wooden bench behind the house near the well. The afternoon sun filtered through the coffee leaves, painting everything in soft golden green. Quan drew a bucket of fresh well water, heated a portion over the fire until it was warm, then returned with a clean basin and soft cloth. "Let me take care of you," he said gently. Tu Lac's cheeks flushed. "Quan, it's embarrassing. There's no one here but us," he whispered, "and even if there were, I wouldn't care." He helped her out of her damp nightgown with reverent hands, careful around the healing incision. Using the warm cloth, he washed her arms, her neck, her shoulders. Every touch slow and deliberate, like a prayer. When he reached the scar on her lower abdomen, he paused, then leaned down and pressed the softest kiss there. Tu Lac's breath hitched. "It's ugly now." "It's beautiful," he corrected, voice thick with emotion. "It brought our son into this world. It kept you alive for me." He continued bathing her, the warm water trailing down her skin like gentle rain. Their eyes met and held. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the scent of wet earth and coffee, the world outside, the lawsuits, the lost empire, the threats, faded. There was only the two of them. Quan dried her carefully, then helped her into a fresh, simple dress borrowed from a neighbor. He sat behind her on the bench, his strong thighs bracketing hers, and began massaging her swollen feet. His thumbs pressed into the sore arches with just the right pressure. Tu Lac sighed, leaning back against his chest. "You're going to spoil me." "Good," he murmured against her hair. "You deserve to be spoiled for the rest of your life." A light rain began to fall again, soft, romantic, the kind that made the coffee leaves shimmer. Quan didn't move. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, holding her close as the rain misted over them. Tu Lac tilted her head back, and their lips met in a slow, deep kiss. It tasted of salt from her tears and the clean rain. His hand cradled the back of her neck as the kiss deepened, full of aching tenderness and quiet desperation. The need to reassure each other that they were still here, still together. "I love you," he breathed against her mouth. "Not the empire, not the money, just you. This version of us." Tu Lac turned in his arms, cupping his face. "Even when you come home covered in mud and smell like the fields?" "Especially then." He smiled for the first time in days, a small, genuine curve of his lips that made her heart ache with love. That evening, as golden twilight bathed the hills, Mrs. Huang slipped away to the edge of the plantation with Uncle Tu's old phone. She made a long international call, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please tell Lan An that I'm sorry. I destroyed her life. If she can find it in her heart to come back and tell the truth, even just once, I will accept any punishment. But my son and daughter-in-law, they don't deserve this." The reply came after a long silence. "She says she's built a new life abroad. She doesn't want to reopen old wounds." Mrs. Huang sank to her knees in the wet grass, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. Night fell softly over the thatched hut. The kerosene lamp burned low. Quan lay on the narrow bed with Tu Lac curled against his chest, and their baby nestled safely between them. The infant's tiny hand clutched Quan's finger, even in sleep. Quan stroked Tu Lac's hair, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. He thought she was asleep until she whispered, "Quan, are you scared?" "Every day," he admitted, "but not of losing everything again. I'm scared of losing you, of one day waking up and realizing I couldn't protect the only things that matter." She lifted her head, eyes glistening in the dim light. "You have protected us, every single day." Their foreheads touched, then their lips. The kiss was slow, lingering, full of unspoken promises. His hand slid gently down her back, pulling her closer without demanding anything more than comfort. They kissed like that for a long time, soft, cinematic, the kind of kiss that existed in the space between heartbreak and hope. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them. The baby sighed contentedly. Outside, crickets sang, and the wind rustled through the coffee trees like a lullaby. Quan's phone, left on the small wooden stool beside the bed, lit up with a single message from their lawyer. "We have a real chance if Lanan testifies, but she's refusing to return. Min is pushing new charges against all three of you. Prepare yourselves." Quan read the message in the dark. His jaw tightened, but he didn't wake Tu Lac. Instead, he pressed a long, protective kiss to the top of her head and tightened his arms around his family. "We'll face it together," he whispered into her hair. "Always." The next few days blurred into a rhythm both punishing and healing. The coffee hills of Dak Lak did not care about empires lost or lawsuits pending. They simply demanded work, sweat, and patience. Quan left the thatched hut every morning before sunrise, his shoulders already aching from the previous day's labor. He worked alongside the villagers, learning to harvest ripe coffee cherries, prune branches, and carry heavy baskets on his back down muddy paths. His designer shirts were long gone, replaced by faded baba tunics stained with earth and sweat. Blisters turned into calluses. The man who once closed million-dollar deals now measured his worth by how many rows he could finish before the sun climbed too high. Each time he returned at midday, covered in red dust, he found Tu Lac waiting. She was growing stronger, but the recovery was slow and painful. Today, she had managed to walk to the small bench by the well on her own. When she saw him, her eyes lit up despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "You look tired," she said softly as he approached. Quan dropped to one knee in front of her, resting his forehead against her lap for a moment. "I'm okay. How are you and our son?" The baby finally nursed well this morning. She threaded her fingers through his damp hair. "Mother helped me." Mrs. Huang stood a few steps away, stirring a pot of herbal soup over the fire. Her once elegant hands were now rough and blistered from washing diapers in cold well water and chopping firewood. She moved with quiet humility, no longer the formidable matriarch, but a grandmother trying desperately to earn her place in this broken family. "I made soup for Lac," Mrs. Huang said without turning around. "It's not much, but it should help with her milk." Quan lifted his head and looked at his mother. For the first time in weeks, there was no anger in his eyes, only a complicated mix of gratitude and lingering pain. "Thank you, Mother." That afternoon, while the baby napped, Quan drew another bucket of well water and warmed it. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and fragrant with wet earth and coffee blossoms. He carried Tu Lac to the private corner behind the hut, where a simple bamboo screen gave them a little privacy. "Let me help you again," he murmured. Tu Lac hesitated, cheeks pink. "Quan, you don't have to do this every day." "I want to." His voice was low, almost reverent. "Taking care of you is the only thing that still feels right in this world." He undressed her gently, mindful of every bruise and healing scar. The warm cloth glided over her skin, across her collarbones, down her arms, over the soft curve of her stomach where their child had grown. When he reached the cesarean scar, he paused, tracing it lightly with his fingertips before leaning in to kiss it with aching tenderness. Tu Lac's breath trembled. "It still hurts sometimes, not just the body." "I know," he whispered against her skin. "Let me carry some of that pain." He bathed her with slow, loving strokes, the water tracing shimmering paths down her body. The afternoon light filtered through the coffee leaves above them, casting dappled patterns across her skin. Quan's hands were rough from farm work, yet his touch remained impossibly gentle. When he finished, he wrapped her in a clean cloth and pulled her into his lap on the wooden bench. Tu Lac rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of earth and sweat that was now so uniquely him. "I used to dream about luxury, about giving our child everything. Now I just want him to grow up knowing his father is the strongest man I've ever known. Quan's arms tightened around her, and his mother is the bravest. A light drizzle began to fall again, soft, romantic, the kind of rain that made the world feel intimate. Neither of them moved. Quan tilted her chin up and kissed her. The kiss started slow and sweet, lips brushing like a promise. Then it deepened, filled with all the fear, relief, and love they had been holding back. His hand cradled her jaw as their tongues met gently, tasting rain and salt. Tu Lac clutched his shirt, pouring every unspoken word into the kiss. How much she needed him, how grateful she was, how terrified she still felt. When they finally parted, foreheads pressed together, Quan whispered, "I would lose 100 empires if it meant keeping you like this." They stayed like that until the rain eased, wrapped in each other under the coffee trees. Inside the hut that evening, Mrs. Huang sat by the kerosene lamp, writing a long letter by hand. She had asked Uncle Tu to help her find a way to send it abroad. The letter was addressed to Lan. "I was cruel and blind. I took everything from you out of fear and pride. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I only ask that you consider telling the truth. Not for me, but for my son and his wife who have suffered enough because of my sins." She sealed the letter with trembling hands, tears falling onto the paper. Later that night, after the baby had been fed and settled, Quan and Tu Lac lay together on the narrow bed. Mrs. Huang slept on a mat nearby, giving them what little privacy the small space allowed. The lamp had been turned low, casting a golden glow across the earthen walls. Quan traced lazy circles on Tu Lac's arm, his body curved protectively around hers. "Do you remember the first time we came to this village?" he asked quietly. Tu Lac smiled faintly. "You were so out of place. The city boy trying to impress me by pretending he knew how to climb coffee trees. I fell twice." He chuckled softly, the sound warm against her hair. "You laughed until you cried. I think I started falling for you that day." She turned in his arms to face him, their noses brushed. "Not because you were rich or powerful, but because you tried. You always tried for me." Quan's eyes darkened with emotion. He kissed her again, deeper this time, slower, savoring every second. His hand slipped under her nightgown to rest warmly on her waist, not demanding, only cherishing. Their legs tangled together as the kiss grew more urgent, yet remained tender, full of the quiet passion that had survived every storm. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Quan rested his forehead against hers. "No matter what happens with the lawsuit," he vowed, "this is enough. You, our son, and these hills. I will build us a new life here with my own hands." Tu Lac's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I believe you." They fell asleep like that, entwined, hearts beating in sync, the baby nestled safely between them. The following morning brought the storm they had been dreading. Quan was sharpening a harvesting knife outside when his phone rang. The signal was weak, but the lawyer's voice came through clearly enough to shatter the fragile peace. "Quan, I have news. We have a strong chance to fight the new charges. If Lan agrees to testify, she has evidence that could clear your mother and expose Min's deeper involvement. But she's still refusing. She says the past nearly destroyed her once. She's built a quiet life overseas and doesn't want to come back." Quan's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. "There must be something we can do. We're trying, but Min is aggressive. He's filed additional complaints against all three of you. If we can't get Lan's statement soon, things could get very difficult." When Quan stepped back inside, his face was pale. Tu Lac noticed immediately. She handed the baby to Mrs. Huang and reached for her husband. "What is it?" Quan pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. His shoulders trembled slightly as he fought for control. "Lan won't come back. Without her, we may lose everything again." Mrs. Huang, who had been feeding the baby, froze. Tears welled in her eyes. "This is still my fault. I will go to the authorities myself. I will confess everything and take full responsibility." "No," Quan said firmly, lifting his head. "We face this as a family. No more sacrifices alone." Tu Lak cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. "Then we fight, together, just like you promised under the moonlight." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in fiery orange and deep purple, Quan carried Tu Lak out to the edge of the plantation. They sat on a flat rock overlooking the endless rows of coffee trees. Mrs. Huang stayed behind with the baby, giving them this moment. The wind whispered through the leaves. Quan held Tu Lak close, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her like armor. "I'm scared too," she admitted quietly. "But when I look at you, working in the fields, bathing me with well water, holding our son, I remember why I fell in love with you. Not the CEO, the man, my man." Quan turned her in his arms and kissed her with everything he had. The kiss was deep, passionate, and full of quiet desperation. Their lips moved together as the sunset bathed them in golden light. His hands cradled her face as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. When they parted, both were breathing hard, tears mixing with the remnants of the day's sweat. "No matter what comes tomorrow," Quan whispered against her lips, "I choose you, again and again, in this life and everyone after." Tu Lak smiled through her tears and kissed him once more. Soft, lingering, a promise sealed under the dock-lock sky. As night fell and they returned to the humble hut, Quan's phone lit up with another message from the lawyer. "Min is preparing to push for immediate arrest warrants. We need a miracle, or Lan An." Quan read it in silence, then slipped the phone away. He climbed into bed, pulling Tu Lak and their son close. In the flickering light of the kerosene lamp, he pressed a long kiss to his wife's forehead. "We are the miracle," he whispered into the darkness. "We have to be." After losing their last wooden house, Quan, Tu Lak, and Mrs. Huang are forced to take shelter in a humble thatched hut deep in the coffee hills of Dak Lak. Facing harsh living conditions with no electricity or running water, Quan works tirelessly in the fields as a simple farmer, while Mrs. Huang humbly learns to cook, wash diapers, and care for her family as an act of atonement. In the midst of poverty and exhaustion, Quan and Tu Lak's love grows even deeper through tender, heartfelt moments. From bathing his recovering wife with warm well water to passionate kisses under the soft rain and golden sunset, their bond becomes the only light in their darkest days. However, hope is shattered when the lawyer delivers devastating news. Lan An refuses to return and testify, with Min aggressively pushing new charges against the entire family. Their fragile peace is once again on the brink of collapse.